As winter surrendered to spring in northeastern France, 1945, the small village of Merville stood in the uneasy twilight of German occupation. The stone buildings of the village square, once vibrant with market day crowds, had witnessed nearly 5 years of requisitions, curfews, and the occasional crack of rifle fire in the distant woods where resistance fighters moved like ghosts. But it was the camp on the edge of town that cast the longest shadow. Stalag 7A, a satellite facility of the larger POW network, housed nearly 200 Allied airmen and captured resistance operatives. The compound's double fences and watchtowers interrupted what had once been placid farmland. From these towers, Wehrmacht guards, who had arrived as conquerors, now scanned the eastern horizon with growing apprehension. Captain Werner Kleinschmidt, the camp's 47-year-old commandant, received the twice-daily dispatches with thinning patience. The radio reports confirmed what the senior officers already knew: Germany was losing on every front. American armored divisions had crossed the Rhine at Remagen. Soviet forces were pushing toward Berlin. The Third Reich, promised to last 1,000 years, would not survive the spring. "The supply train is delayed again," Kleinschmidt's adjutant reported that morning. "4 days now, Herr Hauptmann." Kleinschmidt nodded, his weathered face betraying nothing. The camp's storage cellars held perhaps 5 days of rations at reduced portions. The garrison's ammunition stores were similarly depleted. These were practical problems that demanded practical solutions. But underlying them was a deeper concern that few German officers spoke about openly. What would happen when the Americans arrived? In Merville's café, where resistance messages had passed beneath the countertop for years, Marcel Fournier poured coffee for the village doctor. The brew was mostly chicory. Real coffee had disappeared years ago, but the ritual remained. "They say the Americans executed the guards at Gardelegen," the doctor whispered, "after finding what the SS did to the prisoners." Marcel shook his head. "These aren't SS, just Wehrmacht conscripts, most of them." "Does that matter? After what we've endured?" Throughout the village, similar conversations unfolded in hushed tones. Everyone had suffered under occupation: the requisitioned livestock, the missing sons who had either been sent to labor camps or disappeared into the Maquis resistance, the young women who averted their eyes when passing German soldiers. Vengeance seemed a natural right of the liberated. Hey folks, I really appreciate you watching this historical documentary series. If you're enjoying this exploration of complex human moments during World War II, please consider subscribing to our channel. We'd also love to know where you're watching from. Drop us a comment below. Now let's continue with the story of Merville's final days under occupation. At the camp, the guards' routines continued with Teutonic precision, though the purpose had changed. What had once been about preventing escape was now about maintaining order. Until what? This question haunted Kleinschmidt as he reviewed the camp ledgers. Some of his men had already deserted, slipping away in the night. Others looked to him for guidance, their faces reflecting the same uncertainty that gnawed at his conscience. "The prisoners are asking about rations," reported Feldwebel Müller, the senior non-commissioned officer. "Word has spread about the supply situation." Kleinschmidt stared through his office window at the compound where Allied prisoners gathered in small groups, their conversations animated despite the chill morning air. These men knew liberation was coming. They had maintained discipline remarkably well, considering the circumstances. Escape attempts had actually decreased in recent weeks. Why risk death with freedom so close at hand? "Maintain the current distribution," Kleinschmidt ordered. "Half rations if necessary by tomorrow, and double the guards at the perimeter." This last command was not to prevent prisoners from escaping, but to protect them from the reprisals of retreating German units who had become increasingly desperate and brutal. In the village bakery, Henri Lefebvre stoked the brick oven as he had done every morning for 40 years. The German occupation had regulated his flour supply, dictated his production quotas, and taken his eldest son to a labor camp near Cologne. Yet each morning he still produced what bread he could for the village. "They've reduced our allocation again," his wife noted, checking their dwindling flour stores. Henri nodded grimly. Enough for the village, barely, nothing for the camp delivery. This had been the arrangement for years. A percentage of Merville's bread production went directly to the POW camp. It was a requirement of occupation, another indignity among many. But as Henri shaped the loaves, his calloused hands working automatically, he contemplated what would happen when that obligation ended. Radio broadcasts from London, secretly received in attics and cellars throughout Merville, had been detailing the advance of Allied forces. Liberation was perhaps days away, a week at most. With it would come a reckoning. The village mayor, Marcel's cousin Philippe, had called a clandestine meeting for that evening to discuss what should be done when the Germans inevitably surrendered or fled. At the camp perimeter, where the guards patrolled with increasing nervousness, a young German private named Kurt Weber contemplated his options. 20 years old, conscripted from agricultural college in Bavaria, he had spent 2 years at this camp. Unlike some of his comrades, he had never mistreated prisoners, had even smuggled extra rations to an English pilot with tuberculosis. Would that matter when the Americans arrived with their Sherman tanks and their righteousness? Kurt had heard rumors of what happened to camp guards in other liberated areas: public beatings, summary executions, tribunals that served only to formalize predetermined punishments. His sergeant had already buried his uniform insignia and acquired civilian clothes, planning to blend into the refugee streams heading east. But Kurt had seen how collaborators were treated by the newly liberated French. There would be nowhere to hide. As dusk settled over Merville, the first stars appeared above the church spire that had watched over the village for 8 centuries. In the stone-walled cellar beneath the mayor's house, 20 villagers gathered in the flickering lamplight. The German curfew made such meetings dangerous, but tonight there were more pressing concerns than occupation regulations. The liberation of Merville was coming, and with it, difficult questions of justice, vengeance, and humanity that would test the soul of a village that had endured occupation, but had not yet faced the complex moral challenges of freedom. As food supplies dwindled throughout occupied France in early 1945, Stalag 137, a prison camp housing Allied airmen and resistance fighters, faced a critical shortage. Located just outside the village of Écouves in northeastern France, the camp's German administration had maintained strict control for years, but was now witnessing the erosion of both resources and morale. Hauptmann Werner Keller, the camp's interim commander, after his superior was recalled to defend the Reich, found himself in an increasingly untenable position. Each morning, he reviewed dwindling inventory reports while listening to the distant rumble of artillery that seemed to inch closer with each passing day. "We have provisions for perhaps 10 days, Herr Hauptmann," reported Feldwebel Müller, his logistics officer, during a particularly tense morning briefing. "The last supply convoy was diverted to the front. They say we must make do with what we have." Keller nodded grimly. He had seen the map markings showing American armor pushing through the Ardennes. The war was lost. Everyone knew it, yet the official communications still spoke of holding firm. The radio crackled with coded messages warning of severe punishment for any commander who surrendered without explicit orders. Meanwhile, in Écouves, villagers gathered in the cellar beneath Marcel Thibault's tavern. For years, this low-ceilinged room had served as an impromptu town hall whenever German patrols were absent. Now, with liberation seemingly imminent, the atmosphere was charged with both anticipation and anxiety. "They will run soon," declared Philippe Roux, who had lost a son to a German firing squad in 1942. "And when they do, we must be ready. There are scores to settle." Several voices murmured in agreement, but Madame Fournier, the village baker's wife, raised her hand. At 62, she commanded respect not only as the oldest person present, but as someone whose bread had sustained the village through the darkest days of occupation. "What will happen to the prisoners when the Germans panic?" she asked simply. 300 men, Americans, British, and our own resistance fighters, might be abandoned without food, or worse. The room fell silent. Few had considered this aspect of the imminent German collapse. "We have seen the reports from the east," said Marcel Thibault softly. "When the Russians liberate camps, they often find—" He trailed off, unwilling to articulate the horrors described in whispered accounts from the Eastern Front. Madame Fournier spoke again. "Perhaps it is not just the prisoners we should consider, but also what kind of village we wish to be when this war finally ends." Her husband Henri, who had quietly maintained the village bakery through 5 years of occupation, stepped forward. "I propose something that may sound mad. We continue to bake, not just for ourselves, but for the camp, for everyone there." The suggestion was met with shocked silence, followed by erupting objections. "Bread for the Boche, after everything?" Roux was incredulous. "Not primarily for the guards," Henri clarified, "for the prisoners, our allies. But yes, bread that sustains everyone, the guards included." That night, the debate continued for hours. Some villagers recounted personal grievances against specific guards. Others reminded the gathering of small mercies, the German medical officer who had provided penicillin for a village child, the sentry who occasionally looked away when food was smuggled toward the resistance. By dawn, a fragile consensus emerged. The village would continue providing bread to the camp, even as German authority crumbled. This was not forgiveness, many insisted, but a practical humanitarian measure to protect the prisoners and, perhaps, prevent desperate last actions by cornered guards. The following morning, as mist still hung over the field separating Écouves from Stalag 137, an unusual procession formed outside the village bakery. 6 villagers, led by Henri and Madame Fournier, loaded handcarts with fresh loaves, bread made from the last of their precious flour reserves. At the camp's main gate, the German sentries observed the approaching villagers with suspicion. Standing orders were to turn away civilians, but food deliveries had become increasingly irregular. Obergefreiter Schultz, manning the gate, raised his rifle nervously. "Halt! What is this?" he called out in accented French. Henri stepped forward. "Bread," he said simply, "for the camp." "By whose orders?" Schultz demanded. "By no orders," replied Henri. "The village has bread. The camp needs bread." Confusion registered on the young guard's face. He beckoned a superior, and soon Feldwebel Müller arrived, surveying the villagers with cautious interest. "Our supply lines are compromised," Müller stated flatly, his gaze fixed on the bread rather than the villagers' faces. "You bring this voluntarily?" Henri nodded. "For the prisoners, and for whoever else needs to eat." After a brief radio exchange with Hauptmann Keller, Müller directed the villagers to unload their handcarts at the supply depot. As they passed through the outer perimeter, Henri noticed how the German guards avoided eye contact, some from shame, others from lingering pride, but all seeming to understand the changing reality their bread delivery represented. Inside the administrative building, Hauptmann Keller observed the transaction from his window. The arrival of village bread presented both a solution and a complication. It addressed their critical supply shortage, but also signaled a fundamental shift in authority. The villagers were no longer acting under compulsion, they were making a choice. This subtle transfer of moral agency was not lost on Keller, a former university history professor who understood symbolism all too well. "Shall I have the bread checked for tampering, Herr Hauptmann?" asked Muller after supervising the delivery. Keller shook his head. If they wished us harm, they could simply wait a few more days for the Americans. He paused, then added, "Distribute it equally. Prisoners and guards receive the same ration." This directive raised eyebrows among the German staff, but was implemented nonetheless. Within hours, the unexpected bread delivery transformed the camp atmosphere. Prisoners who had been preparing for their rations to vanish entirely suddenly found fresh loaves being distributed. Many were initially suspicious, but hunger quickly overcame caution. The village's bread deliveries continued daily, establishing a strange new routine during the war's final uncertain phase. Each morning, the villagers would arrive with whatever they had managed to bake, and the Germans would accept it with decreasing formality. Occasionally, brief conversations developed between villagers and guards, awkward, stilted exchanges about the weather or harvest prospects, carefully avoiding mention of the approaching front or what might happen after. For Hauptmann Keller, these deliveries became a lifeline, not just for sustenance, but for maintaining order. With supply lines severed and desertion among guards increasing, the reliable arrival of village bread provided structure, something increasingly valuable as military discipline frayed. In the village, the decision remained contentious. Some residents refused to participate, viewing the bread deliveries as collaboration at a moment when resistance should have peaked. Others saw it as their finest hour, maintaining humanity when history might have justified vengeance. 1 week into this arrangement, Allied reconnaissance aircraft began appearing overhead with increasing frequency. Radio reports indicated American forces were less than 30 miles away. The question on everyone's mind, in both village and camp, was what would happen when they arrived. As April 1945 dawned on the small village of Merville in northeastern France, the distant thunder of artillery no longer seemed so distant. American forces were approaching from the southwest, while British units pressed in from the northwest. For the German guards at Stalag 142, the makeshift prison camp that had housed Allied airmen and captured resistance fighters since 1942, the question was no longer if they would face American troops, but when. Oberleutnant Werner Richter, the camp's second-in-command, stood at the wire perimeter, watching villagers approach with their daily delivery of bread. For 3 weeks now, this ritual had continued, despite dwindling flour reserves in the village. The German supply lines had collapsed entirely. "They bring bread knowing we cannot pay," he remarked to a fellow officer. "I do not understand these people." What Richter couldn't know was how the village council had debated this very question through long nights in the back room of Madame Leclerc's café. The decision to continue feeding both prisoners and guards had not been unanimous. Auguste Dupont, whose son had been shot during a 1943 roundup, had pounded the table and walked out. But Mayor Thibault's quiet voice had eventually prevailed. "What happens in these final days will be remembered for generations," he had told them. "Let history show we remained human when others did not." On April 11th, as American Sherman tanks of the 4th Armored Division approached the village outskirts, Hauptmann Keller, the camp commandant, called his officers together. Reports of summary executions of SS personnel had reached them via military radio. The regular Wehrmacht guards feared similar treatment. "We will surrender properly," Keller instructed. "All camp records intact. No documents destroyed. We have maintained proper conduct under the Geneva Convention." This last claim stretched the truth considerably. In 1943, 8 escaped prisoners had been shot while attempting to flee. Food rations had been cut below minimum requirements during the winter of 1944, yet in these final weeks, conditions had notably improved. American Lieutenant James Woodson, a B-17 navigator shot down over Belgium in 1944, later recorded in his debriefing. The strangest thing was that final month. We actually had bread every day, real bread from the village. The guards seemed almost concerned about our welfare. It was as if they suddenly remembered the Geneva Convention existed. Dawn broke on April 12th with the sound of vehicles on the main road. German sentries nervously watched from their towers as 3 American jeeps, followed by 2 tanks, approached the camp entrance. No shots were fired. Hauptmann Keller walked out under a white flag, carrying camp records and prisoner rosters. Captain Michael Donovan of the 4th Armored Division described the scene in his after-action report. German surrender was orderly and without incident. 24 guards surrendered weapons. Camp records were provided voluntarily. Initial assessment showed prisoners in reasonable condition, considering circumstances. Local French civilians were already at the gates with food. As American medics entered the camp to assess the prisoners, villagers gathered outside. Among them stood Pierre Laurent, the village baker, still carrying his delivery basket. The Americans looked at us strangely, Laurent later recalled. One officer asked through an interpreter why we were bringing food for the Germans. I told him it wasn't for the Germans. It was for the men inside and for ourselves. Within hours, the prisoners were receiving proper medical attention. The German guards were disarmed and temporarily held in the same administrative building where they had once processed incoming prisoners. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Military intelligence officers began processing the German personnel, separating those against whom prisoners had made specific allegations of mistreatment. 3 guards, including a particularly brutal sergeant known for arbitrary punishment, were detained for further investigation. The remaining guards, including Keller and Richter, were transferred to a POW collection point. During his interrogation, Hauptmann Keller made a statement that intelligence officers initially dismissed as self-serving. The local civilians treated us with unexpected dignity these past weeks. They had every reason for hatred, but they brought food when they had little for themselves. It affected how we managed the final days. Subsequent prisoner debriefings confirmed a change in guard behavior after the bread deliveries began. Headcounts became less rigorous. Medicine from the camp's limited supply was distributed more generously. Even exercise periods were extended. Mayor Thibault was interviewed by an American civil affairs officer concerned about possible collaboration. The mayor's response was preserved in official records. Collaboration, no, Lieutenant, humanity. There is a difference. When they arrived in 1941, they were conquerors. When they left in 1945, they were just hungry men far from home. And how we treated them at the end will define us long after the memories of occupation fade. Within days, the former prisoners were evacuated to repatriation centers. The camp itself stood empty, its watchtowers silent. In the village, difficult conversations continued. Auguste Dupont refused to speak to the mayor for weeks, while others debated whether their actions constituted misplaced mercy or moral victory. In his memoir published in 1957, former prisoner Flight Lieutenant William Harris of the RAF wrote, "I've often wondered about those final weeks and the village bread. Did it save lives? Perhaps not directly, but it created a space where guards saw us as men again, not just enemies. And perhaps more importantly, it allowed those villagers to reclaim something the occupation had tried to take from them, their fundamental decency." The stone wall that once formed part of Stalag 142's perimeter still stands along the Merville Road. Every April 12th, a small ceremony takes place there. No grand speeches, no military parades, just villagers placing loaves of bread atop the wall. It is their way of remembering not what was done to them, but what they chose to do when presented with the ultimate test of their humanity. As American forces pushed eastward toward Germany, the story of Merville briefly captured attention in military circles. General Patton reportedly commented that it demonstrated the incomprehensible nature of the French. But Chaplain Thomas Welch of the 4th Armored perhaps understood better when he noted in his journal, "In a war defined by hatred, these villagers chose to end their part in it by refusing hatred's final satisfaction. There may be more courage in that than in any battlefield I've witnessed."